So welcome everybody to, this is our last 201 series in the clinical faculty development series. And we're delighted that Doctors Mike Stein and Paul Hemmer are here to talk about directing a medical education program over geographically separate sites. Before they get started, I've got some housekeeping to go through real quick with people. Next slide, please. So we do have CME that we offer through the University of North Carolina. And this is a standard disclosure statement, so we needed to include for this presentation. And I will be sending all of the information to their office after this is over with to let them know who to contact to claim CME credit for the series. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, this is a clinical development series that we created based off of the guidebook for Clerkship Directors 5th edition. Last year, we did several of them in our 101 series, and we're wrapping up 201. 301 will begin this fall, and we'll be notifying you through our standard social media and listserv notifications, so that way you can join those as well. Next slide. So this is just the first series. If you go to the allianceforclinical.education.org, our website, we have the clinical faculty development series listed there, and all of the ones from last year are there and recordings are available. Next slide. So this is what we've covered this year. And like I said, this is the 201 series. Next slide, please. And this is a teaser for the topics that are coming up for next year. And we're going to be contacting people to start lining those up and getting dates lined up for the coming year. Next slide. And for those of you that don't know, this is the guidebook for clerkship directors, and it is available through our publisher and on our website. But it's a fantastic book in my opinion, but it's one of those things. It's the 5th edition. We're actually getting ready to start working on the 6th edition. And the talk today is based off of the 4th chapter on directing a clerkship over geographically separate sites. And with that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to you, Mike and Paul, and you can take it from there.
Thanks a lot, Gary. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Our objectives today are to define geographically separate sites, to discuss the benefits and challenges of having geographically separate sites, to review key accreditation standards, and to discuss what to do before, during, and after you set up a geographically separate site, and to emphasize the role of conversation and shared leadership. We're going to try and cover lots of material today, so I appreciate everybody taking time from their busy schedule for their lunch hour on the East Coast. So except for some poll everywhere questions, I'm going to ask you to please save your questions to the end, or perhaps put them in the chat box, and we can save them for the end, or Gary can monitor them. Our disclaimer is that the opinions and assertions expressed herein are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or positions of the Uniformed Services University or the Department of Defense. This is our outline today. We're going to go over some introductions, some background definitions, what's the relevance of having geographically separate sites, talk briefly about accreditation standards for those sites, then talk about how to make it work, running geographically separate sites, and finally a little epilogue on COVID-19 and how that might have affected running these sites. This is who we are. I'm Michael Stein, Assistant Professor and Associate Internal Medicine Clerkship Director at Madigan Army Medical Center here in Tacoma, Washington. And my co-presenter is Dr. Paul Hemmer. He's Professor of Medicine and Professor of Health Professions Education and Vice Chair for the Educational Programs at the Department of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland. We both worked for the Uniformed Services University School of Medicine, which is the Leadership Academy of Military Medicine. The Uniformed Services University has multiple geographically separate clerkship sites, including sites over 4,000 miles from the central campus in Bethesda, Maryland. Does everybody know how to use poll everywhere? We'd actually like to find out a little bit about all of you. So if you could either take out your cell phones or go under your laptop computers and go ahead and text to 2233, my name, Mike Stein 299, or on the website at pollev.com/ Mike Stein 299, go ahead and text sign up. It'll just take a minute or two, and then it will tell you that you've joined and that you can participate. My first question when you've all gotten signed up is, what state or country do you work in? Please use perhaps 2 or 3 letters abbreviations. Great. So far, people from the West Coast, from the East Coast, from the middle of the country, somebody from Canada. Great that you could join. Great. Just give it another minute or so. That's great. Okay. Looks like Ohio and Texas especially have some good representation here today. Would also like to know, do you primarily work in undergraduate medical education or GME? Give you a minute. Great. So it looks like most people are actually working undergraduate medical education. That's probably going to be the focus of the rest of this talk. Although a lot's applicable also to residency GME programs. What is your role in medical education? Are you a site director of a clerkship like myself? Are you a clerkship director, residency director? Are you in charge of the program, work in the dean's office, or provide administrative support? Wow, great. That's interesting. A lot of representation from the dean's offices, more so than the clerkship directors. Great. Hope you all get some good out of all of this. Appreciate you coming. So let's start off with some background definitions. What is a geographically separate site? For the purpose of this webinar, we're going to define a geographically separate site as any training location that's not part of the program's central campus. This applies to both inpatient and ambulatory sites. And for clerkships, it applies to sites that are separate from the medical school central campus. For GME or residency programs, the site refers to sites that are away from the primary sponsoring institution. So this is a map of our internal medicine clerkship sites across the country. We have a site everywhere where there's a little star. I'm up in that top left there in Tacoma, Washington. My co-presenter, Dr. Hemmer, is down there in Maryland on the right side of the country, and you can see we even have a star in Hawaii. But geographically separate sites are not confined to sites that are spread off across the country. In fact, it can be at a much smaller geographical area. So perhaps if your site is in New York City, your main site might be in the borough of Brooklyn, but you might have geographically separate sites also in Queens or the Bronx, for instance. There might have been times when it seems that at one of your sites that even two ward teams are worlds apart in their teaching styles and learning experiences. The point is that the geography itself is not always the biggest barrier. The biggest barrier is trying to get everybody on the same page and communicating what the goals and objectives of the program are. So another poll question for you both. What do you guys think is the benefit to having geographically separate sites in your experience? You can type in one word, or you can actually put in a longer phrase by linking the words with a little squiggly tilde. Capacity, right? Great. You guys were mentioning a lot of the things that we feel are some of the benefits. Talk about diversity of experiences. Patient experiences might be different. Populations are different. Different faculty, different opportunities, easier scheduling, more capacity. That's wonderful. Those are all things that we think are benefits of geographically separate sites. Some of the benefits that we'd like to highlight are, as you know, the clinical training itself for the students is not a massive open online course. Students need to have authentic ways to interact one-to-one with patients, with real patients. Geographically separate sites, though, can help compensate by compensating if your program has increased class sizes, which is often the case now as the medical schools across the country are trying to address physician shortages, or perhaps your particular location, your community needs more physicians. And how do you train those physicians? Having more geographically separate sites can be a help. There can also be physician or teacher shortages at a given site. That happens to us not infrequently, as we're a uniform services training facility. And so some of our teachers are active duty and have to get deployed, for instance. And so then we have one less teacher. So how do we compensate for that? Often by maybe moving students to other sites. You also mentioned in your poll responses, which we agree with, it gives your program increased breadth. Perhaps there's a experience that they might get at one site, not the other. Perhaps you want them to get at a site that has more underserved population experience, or one that might have a burn unit. It's also important to recognize that there's been a shift in patient populations and where care is rendered. More teaching goes on in the ambulatory settings now because a lot of medicine is, with our medical advances, is given in the ambulatory setting. So that might mean that there's less inpatient settings. So you have less places for students to go to do their inpatient ward training. And by having more geographically separate sites, you may be able to balance that out. But the ultimate goal of having geographically separate sites is to provide the highest quality education for trainees, right? So we talked about the benefits. What do y'all think are the main challenges in running geographically separate sites, or that you've experienced, or the main challenges? Good. Great. We would agree with a lot of that. Everybody's putting up some great, mentioning some very important challenges. Are they comparable, all the different sites? How do you communicate between them? What's the quality of their experience? How do you administer multiple sites? How do you keep them all in compliance? Do they all have adequate resources? Great. That's what I'm going to talk about next. So there are definitely multiple challenges with having multiple geographically separate sites in your program. But I'd like to focus on two important concepts. One, the first on the left-hand side of the screen, is that we got to try and keep everybody on the same sheet of music. How does everybody all adhere to the same goals and objectives of your program? Okay, it's sometimes challenging enough to communicate the goals and objectives of the teaching program to all of the clinical faculty at one site with multiple different clinical schedules. And many of you can probably imagine how much more challenging it is to communicate the goals, objectives, and schedules with clinical faculty at multiple geographically separate sites. The other big topic that often arises is academic cohabitation. Due to the fact that the demand for clinical teaching sites often exceeds the number of teaching sites in a certain area, it's not unusual that two or more programs actually use the same site. In fact, even a study from 20 years ago, they found that approximately a quarter of internal medicine inpatient teams have students from at least two different schools on their team. However, the LCME accrediting body emphasizes in one of their white papers, which we provide a link to here, that it's important that teaching faculty are clear about the goals and objectives of each school that's at their site, even if there's two students that are sharing the same team. For that reason, the LCME actually discourages students from different schools to work on the same ward team. I think it might be confusing for the faculty to sort of understand what differences there might be between the two programs. In addition to the challenges that I just mentioned, all sites, as you're probably aware, need to maintain need to meet accreditation standards for their accrediting bodies. The goal of such standards is to set minimum requirements for each site to be able to provide a high quality education. And in fact, there are certain standards specifically for geographically separate sites. In terms of the undergraduate medical education world, the LCME is the accrediting body, and I'm going to talk more about their standards on the next few slides. For those of you that are here with GME, it's the ACA GME which sets the standards. And they especially emphasize that for geographically separate sites, there must be some common program requirements. And we provide a link to that here. Importantly, importantly, for participating sites, the main program administering those sites must monitor the clinical learning and working environment at all of the participating sites. And at each participating site, there must be at least one faculty member designated by the program director as the site director for that site, who is accountable for resident education at that site in collaboration with the program director. I'd now like to walk you through some of the LCME standards that are most relevant to geographically separate sites. Starting with standard 2.6, functional integration of the faculty. The goal of that standard is that site faculty must be a formal part of the medical school teaching program. Some ways to ensure this goal is met is to have regular meetings, communicate with your site faculty, arrange periodic visits to that site, and allow faculty to participate in the shared governance of the site and to share information on how the program is doing at that site with the faculty. Standard 3.6 revolves around student mistreatment. The goal of that standard is that sites must follow medical school policy addressing student mistreatment. Ways to ensure that students aren't mistreated at a site include making sure that the geographically separate sites follow the school's written policies, and that there's a way for students at separate geographic sites to relay any concerns they have back to the central program. Standard 4.1, sufficiency of faculty. Sites must have sufficient qualified faculty that have time to teach, and since most of them are not 100% dedicated to teaching, must be able to fulfill their clinical duties at that site. And 5.5, resources for clinical instruction. The goal of that standard is that sites must have an adequate mix of clinical resources and patient cases. Standard 5.11. Sites must have study rooms for the students to study in, lounges or similar areas for students to relax in, storage spaces for students to store their study materials, and call rooms if the students need to spend the night. These are all there to ensure that the site's environment is conducive to student learning. Standard 8.7, comparability of education assessment. I'm going to actually read this standard, it's very important. A medical school ensures, some of you brought that up on the poll, a medical school ensures that medical curriculum includes comparable educational experiences and equivalent methods of assessment across all locations within a given course in clerkship to ensure that all medical students achieve the same medical education program objectives. And 9.8 is a similarly important standard for geographically separate sites, fair and timely assessment. The standard states that a medical school has in place a system of fair and timely summative assessment of medical student achievement in each course and clerkship of the medical education program. Final grades are available within 6 weeks of the end of the course of the core clerkship. I'd now like to offer you some strategies to meet 4 of the especially challenging standards for geographically separate sites. Standard 4.4, feedback to faculty. The goal of the standard is to make sure that faculty at geographically separate sites receive regularly scheduled and timely feedback from the department and or other programmatic or institutional leaders on their academic performance and progress toward promotion and when applicable tenure. One way to recognize feedback, as I put up on the left-hand side, is to give teaching awards. Teaching awards are a simple way to recognize outstanding contributions to teachers and can be set up easily. Residents can be recognized similarly. Cash. Paying stipends to community-based faculty is becoming increasingly common and improves or can improve faculty retention. And finally, feedback from the students to the faculty themselves. One study from 10 years ago found that what teachers value the most in their job is that they're notified when trainees are going to come and arrive and work with them, that they have continuity with the trainees, that they get formal communication from program leadership, that they're given clear aims and objectives and outcomes for student teaching, and that they receive feedback from the students. They really value this. Standard 4.4, faculty professional development. This standard's goal is to ensure that a medical school and or its sponsoring institution provides opportunity for professional development to each faculty member in the areas of discipline content, curricular design, program evaluation, student assessment methods, instructional methodology, and research to enhance their skills and leadership abilities in these areas. If medical schools were able to provide such, if medical schools are able to provide such professional development educational activities at no or reduced cost to faculty at each geographically separate site, that would be ideal. Our institution actually has a set of core faculty that travels to different geographically separate sites on a rotating basis to deliver that faculty development curriculum. However, we found that it was challenging for that core faculty to keep up with the demand for faculty development at each site. Thus, as detailed in the reference on the slide below in Clinical Teacher last year, our program put together a Teach the Teachers model where faculty from each of the geographically separate sites would come to the main campus, be trained in faculty development and faculty development principles, and they would take that back to each of their sites to continue faculty development at their sites. However, they found that probably the biggest success of the train the trainer model was that they maintained a community of practice. They didn't just have those trainers be trained and go back to each of their sites and not talk anymore. They maintained a community of practice and where they all discussed ideas for faculty development, and that helped make them feel valued as faculty developers. I'm going to mention a few other ways that you can try and meet this standard for faculty professional development. You can look to the national specialty organizations, the AAMC, and of course, ACE is giving this web seminar to help all of you in your faculty professional development. You can try embedding faculty development in the program of assessment. For our program at evaluation sessions, when I go as a site director to talk with the faculty and find out the feedback from how each of the students were doing and what they observed, I have to calibrate them and remind them of how their observations fit into our RIME assessment model. I already spoke about ways that you can make such faculty professional development regular, perhaps by this train the trainer model I mentioned. And perhaps one of the most critical personnel whose faculty development you need to foster is a geographically separate site director and their personal skills. The importance of choosing, developing, and mentoring site directors cannot be overstated. Site directors extend the clerkship directors and administrators' ability to ensure that each site offers its students effective feedback and consistent assessment, evaluation, curriculum, and experiences. New site directors need a thorough orientation. For our program, we send our new site directors to the CDAM new site director course. It is also best if the clerkship director and administrator create materials such as a master repository of information to provide to each site director, which at a minimum should include the clerkship objectives, the materials to be distributed at each clerkship, copies of commonly used forms, seminal educational articles. Involvement of the key functions of running a clerkship helps site directors acquire a thorough understanding of the clerkship and helps to ensure consistency across sites. Standard 8.7, comparability of education assessment. This standard is one of the most frequently cited as being inadequate on LCME surveys. Therefore, clerkship should really spend time adequately thinking out how they're going to prepare to provide comparable education and assessments. One of the topics they should consider is how are they going to deliver core clerkship topics such as teaching conferences or didactic lectures? Should all the students return back to the main site for the conferences and lectures? Should they go back weekly? Should some core conferences be delivered at each site? In fact, that's what we do for our clerkship program, is that we have a core set of teaching lectures and objectives in internal medicine, but we hand that over to each site to pick certain teachers that are going to deliver that core content. And that helps get some extra buy-in in the program from each of our sites. They're able to tailor their lectures to their own teaching style. Or, especially in times of COVID, students could be ran offsite and perhaps use distant learning modalities such as Zoom, like we're doing today, for some of their content. You also need to think about how are you going to ensure comparable and adequate clinical experiences, that students are getting comparable experiences across your geographically separate sites, both inpatient and ambulatory experiences. One way you can do that is have the students keep logs of the patients they see and see if they are seeing a breadth of patients. We have our students keep a log, and then that log is actually transmitted back to our central site for accountability. Trainees should also provide critiques from the site that they're at. So as a program, you can review the critiques that are coming from each site to see if they're comparable. And then the program needs to decide how they're going to analyze differences that might come up in outcomes between each site to make sure they are comparable and adequate. And this will be discussed in an upcoming slide. Finally, I want to mention the standard 9.8, fair and timely assessment. This standard states that a medical school has in place a system of fair and timely summative assessment of medical school achievement in each course and clerkship of the medical education program. Final grades are available within 6 weeks at the end of the course or clerkship. In order to meet this goal of the standard, the program needs to establish guidelines for how it determines final grades. The clerkship director is the one that's actually responsible for specifying the rubrics that determine final grades. The grading process must be clearly communicated to students and to the site directors. Final grades can be determined by the clerkship director, a grading committee at the central site, or a separate site faculty and directors. Site directors play a key role in collecting, collating, providing narrative and other evaluations, even if they did not determine the students' final grades. And how is a site going to assure that identical methods of assessment? One way that we've chosen to use is to use a common, readily understood framework, like the RHIME model of assessment at each site. Sites can also decide how they're going to document that trainees are being observed, directly observed at each site, and standardize that. Our site has an electronic form. Our site has an electronic form that students complete, send the link to the teachers, and that gets logged back at our central site. Of note, the timing of assessment should be the same across all teaching sites for standardization. Clerkship directors must decide whether to bring all students back to the main campus for final exams or administer the exams at local clerkship site. If examinations are administered at multiple sites, then arrangements must be made to ensure timely delivery and return of the exams, to administer and proctor the exams, and ensure the exams and testing settings are secure. If sites are across time zones, then it's best to synchronize administration over all the sites. And for that, I'd like to now turn it over to my co-presenter, Dr. Hemmer, talked about how to make this all work.
All right, thanks, Mike. I think you're in control of the slides. Oh, I don't like seeing myself on the slides at the same time, but I guess we'll have to just deal with that. All right, everyone, we're going to go through a little bit more now, just about what to do with running a separate site. So next slide. But first, before we get to that, we need to talk, the dreaded phrase. I want to spend just about 2 slides talking about something called conversation theory. So next. So conversation theory arose from—
I'm sorry, I'm on talk right now. I can't talk right now, but I can call you back in just a minute.
Oh. Mike, you might want to mute yourself.
Okay.
So this grew out of the field of cybernetics. Next. So the idea behind conversation theory is how two or more cognitive systems would engage over a concept to try to, and they had differences in understanding and how they could come to an agreement. Now with cybernetics, these two different cognitive systems were human beings and machines. That seems even more relevant today. But we think the theory nonetheless applies. So next. So fundamentally, what conversation theory is about is trying to explain how we reach agreement over an understanding. And that's what we try to do in medical education. Our goal, the understanding is far more complicated a construct. It's competence and making judgments about that. And so how do we all work together? Clerkship directors, site directors, faculty, students, everyone, to do this? How do you reach an agreement over an understanding? So next. So this is just a quick depiction of conversation theory from Paul Pangaro. And there's a link there to a blog that actually explains conversation theory really quite succinctly. The stages of conversation theory are actually hidden under my picture in the upper right-hand corner. But the idea is you have two participants, you have two people or more trying to reach some sort of an agreement in a context. You have to have some sort of shared language, which I think many of us do. But each participant may have a slightly different goal in mind, and it's through conversation and through an exchange of ideas that we get to evaluate what one another are saying, and we eventually move to reaching some sort of an agreement over what that understanding is. So there's actually a theory behind conversation that explains what we're trying to move toward. So next slide. As we move forward, thinking about what we're going to be doing before, during, and after, I'd like you to be thinking about where conversations actually take place in your clinical teaching, in your clerkship teaching programs. So at the bottom, we certainly know that there should be conversations taking place between the individual teacher and the student, typically case-based, related to each individual patient. But fundamentally, how those conversations get shaped should also be grounded in what your goals are for the students on the clerkship. Teachers need to have an understanding of that, and so do students. At the middle level is what Mike explained. You could have conversations that take place with your site director, with the teachers, as a way to find out information about your students at the training site, but it also provides a forum for an exchange of ideas and to ensure that everyone has a shared understanding of what it is you're trying to do. Finally, there are conversations that take place at even higher levels. This may be your clinical competency committee. This might be an education committee in your department. But again, discussions among, say, the clerkship director and the site director, dealing with coming to an agreement over an understanding. Do we have shared goals for the students? Do they need to be modified? And even above that, there are program level committees and certainly the LCME. So again, I want you to think about where these conversations may or may not be taking place in your own system and where you might have opportunities for improvement. So next, and keep going. All right, so before, next slide. Next. So think about some questions that you may want to ask before you actually bring a new site in. Have a good understanding of why you want to do this. It should be to meet objectives. Are there other things that are part of this? Are there mutual benefits to the programs and reasons? Could it not only benefit your undergraduate program, but your GME program? But take time to ask yourself why you're doing this. Next. Have a clear idea about how the site's going to be used. Are you going to use it for ambulatory education, specialty education, inpatient education? It's an issue of fairness to the sites. You don't want mission creep coming in. Next. Decide in advance, again, who's going to administer the site and from what locations? Can you do this centrally? Do you want to do it centrally? Do you want to do it from the site? Do you want to do it regionally? Keep going. Think about the costs and the resources for you not only in personnel, do you need to hire people, administrative costs, other structural costs, what's travel, housing for the students? Next. The site's got to think about their costs as well. In particular, is there an opportunity cost? Is there going to be decreased productivity? It's pretty clear and pretty consistent in the literature, particularly in the ambulatory setting. Certainly early on, students slow you down. They typically add about a 30 minutes to a half day of clinic. That probably gets better as an academic year progresses, but there's going to be an impact. Next. In the guidebook, in one of the tables, there's actually an audit checklist. We're not going to go through the whole checklist. It's there for your reference, but think about using something like this in advance and adapting it to your needs to make sure that you're addressing all the issues. Next. And as you're moving farther along, really do your best to try to do a visit to the site before you actually sign a site agreement. Make sure that you, as a program leader, have eyes on in the site, and so you can ensure that all the standards are going to be met and all your objectives are going to be met. Next. Next. So some of the key steps. We think you're going to need to identify site director. We do think that that's probably the model we think is probably best, rather than trying to run it all from a central location. Who is going to be the administrative support personnel? And is that clear? Is it going to be central, or is it going to be someone at the site? If it's shared duties of the administrator, what's the authority over that individual? Who gets to decide how much time they spend on what work? Next. So we talked about, we're emphasizing this again, make sure that there are resources that are available and that they're adequate to meet your needs. Next. You really do have to think in advance. Mike alluded to this earlier in one of the standards. How will you develop the faculty, and how will you integrate the faculty and site into your program? It is a clear expectation of the LCME that faculty, teachers at their sites are faculty in the medical school. So what's your process for getting them faculty appointments? What's your process for reviewing them? What's your process for helping them, for providing faculty development? You'll need to eventually, you'll need to ratify a clinical training agreement, and we're going to go a little bit more detail now on the next slide. So what are some of the minimum elements? This is an LCMA, in the LCME as well. This is typically taken through an agreements office at most institutions, but I think you should have some familiarity with it. It has to emphasize the primacy of the medical education program's authority over the students. So it is the medical school's responsibility, and they have the ultimate authority over the students, not the individual sites. The agreement needs to clearly spell out both student and faculty access to resources, both locally, and if the faculty get access to things at the medical school, what those are. Medical school has a clear role in the appointment and assignment of faculty members. There needs to be something specified about what happens if a student develops an injury, needs to be or develops an illness while they're on the site, who's responsible for helping to care for the student and with initial care. And that there's a shared responsibility for an appropriate learning environment. So the medical school, the central medical school, remains responsible for the learning environment at all of the teaching sites. If there's a problem with the learning environment at Madigan, for example, where Mike Stein is, that's not just Mike Stein's issue, that's the medical school's issue as well. So we had a few people who are involved in GME, and I think we'll go through this quickly then as a result. So ACGME has a program letter of agreement, and it has very similar elements. Identifying who's going to be your site director, what are the responsibilities, how that's divided up, how long the residents are going to be there, why are they there, what's the content, policies and procedures, again, governing resident education. Very similar to what the LCME expects. Next. All right, so what do you do while you're running the site? What are the things you should be monitoring? Next. So some of the key principles, we think there's a need to engage in regular conversation among program and site leadership. It's our contention that site leadership is program leadership. So Mike is involved with decisions that have to do with the clerkship. He's involved in monthly meetings. He's invested in the program, just as all of our other site directors are. And the key is that it's conversation, that it's two ways. To draw a contrast, basically this webinar is an exercise in communication. This is Mike and I basically doing most of the talking at you with a little bit of response from you, and you'll have a chance to ask us questions. But this is mainly communication, and this is what most of us do, and you need to do it. You need to send out what the goals and objectives are. You need to send out faculty development material. You need to send out resources, but it's not enough. You need to find a way to engage in dialogue and conversation. So next. Have to program in-site visits, not only at the beginning, but how often will you go back to the site? And that includes how often is the clerkship director going to the site? And can you bring the site directors to the main campus? And how often could you do that? And then program evaluation. So what processes are in place to monitor and to know whether or not your program is successful? In particular, are there comparable educational experiences and identical or equivalent methods of assessment? We're coming back. So to talk a little bit more about site leadership and program leadership, I'm going to give you an example. And it also has to do with comparability. This is the study that came out in 2019. You may recognize the senior author from the University of North Carolina. And it talked about what's called a balanced matrix organizational model. As they expanded out into regional sites across the state of North Carolina, there were differences in where they were going. But one of the points of the article is really to talk about how the clerkship personnel at those sites not only have a responsibility and report to both the central campus, but they also report to local leadership. And this adds a layer of complexity because you're operating in a matrix. You're not operating with a single chain of command. Next. But as they go through the article and explain this, that you use that sort of dual leadership model to your advantage, and you try to capitalize on the strengths of both the central campus and the regional sites. I would, not just because Gary is on the call, I would actually really encourage you to read the article because it's a very nice description of the methods of not just communication, but conversation that they put in place and the relationships and how they fostered this idea that site leadership and program leadership are the same. When you go to the article, so next, Mike, there will be a link to a supplement that gives you an example of what they do for clerkship site comparability. What's the analysis that they do? What's the information that they collect? So next. All right. We'll move a little bit more quickly. So there's some key orientations that you have to do. So the site director, you have to make sure is oriented from the beginning and probably repeatedly. They need to understand what their responsibilities are. They have the site director needs to have a clear understanding of the clerkship objectives, medical school policies and procedures. What's the grading policy? Keep going. They should, all your site directors should have a copy of the structure and functions of medical school from the LCME. They should know the standards that are particularly relevant to them. Site director needs to understand the expectations for faculty and residents. What are the lines of communication and conversation? And even just simply how if there's a formal didactic or formal learning program, what that is. Next, and then faculty need an orientation as well. And this includes residents. Similarly, they have to understand what the objectives are, what the frame of reference is, what the policies and procedures are. What's the expectation about their time commitment for teaching, evaluation, and feedback? The level of supervision that the students require. And again, how do they talk to the site director? Can they talk directly to the central program leadership? Next. And then how are you going to provide them feedback on their performance? Next. All right, when we're thinking about after the separate sites after, this is really about program evaluation. And there is a prior seminar that's really devoted to program evaluation. So I think it's from our colleagues at Penn. I would encourage you, if you haven't viewed that, to go back and review that for more details about program evaluation. We're talking here more about principles. So how do you assess for site success? So next. You got to think about what it is that you want to, quote, measure. What are the assessments that you want to use? And some of these things probably need to be some sort of process measures. So to get a sense of what the health of the site is, how many patients are students seeing? What's the complexity? Are students, what are the problems that they're encountering? Are they tracking this with a log? Do you need to track attendance at orientations or at any of the lectures? You may want to track what the timeliness of the evaluations that are coming in. So again, these are all really sort of process measures about, give you a sense about how healthy the program is, how well things are working, if there might be barriers. And the next you might want to then obviously think about are what are some of the product and outcome measures. So how would you judge the quality of the narrative evaluations that are coming in? The comments from faculty and teachers. Is there consistency between what the narratives are and what the recommendations are from faculty? You could certainly look at things like, if you're using grades, grade distribution by site. You could compare exam performance across sites. You could look at trainee critique. You should be looking at trainee critiques as an outcome measure. Next. So as you think about these things, think about how you might control for baseline characteristics of your trainees. So for example, if you see a difference in exam performance across sites, if you don't know what the student's baseline performance is, because we all know exam performance predicts exam performance, you may inappropriately attribute something to the site that is really mainly attributable to the student. So as you're thinking about outcome measures and ways to assess the success of the site, think about what measures that you know about before the students even get to those sites to be able to control from baseline performance. All right, next. We're not going to go through all of these, don't worry. It's here as a reference for you, articles that really go through this in a lot more detail with a lot of nice tables and different ways that you can go about assessing and looking at comparability. Next. All right, so what's the accountability then for this sort of after and looking for comparability across the site? So next. You should have in place some sort of annual review of your clerkship teaching program. Next. This should start at the department or at a program level first. Again, in large part so that you can dive into more detail, take a little bit more time and answer. And if there are questions that come up, you have time to go back and answer them. But whatever gets presented then at the department level should move up the chain. So who are the governing committees who should see and know about this information next? Does this go to one of your curriculum subcommittees? Does it go to the curriculum? Does it go to the dean's office? Or does it stay with you and the dean's office or others are just simply asking you what you're doing? I'd encourage you to create a 12-month calendar and pick a date and time when you're going to do this. Deadlines always help, in particular reminding people about deadlines. I am just as guilty about this as anybody else, but deadlines do make a difference. Next. And then you've got to decide from like the prior, what I said in the prior slide, what is it that you're going to look at? What is it that you're going to report on? What are the measures that are important to you? What are the assessments that reflect your values? So don't just value what you can measure. Try to measure or assess what you value. Next. You should also think about how the information gets to you. So some of this, is this information that you're going to have responsibility for collating? Are there things that the school can provide you, the medical school can provide you, if they're tracking things centrally or in a database? Can they help you with the analysis? But we're going back to this balance matrix organizational model. Involve your local site leadership and stakeholders in this process. Next. So some of the barriers. Admittedly, frameworks only go so far. You can understand the framework. You can understand the framework here, but there's so much else that goes on in a clinical environment, in a teaching program, that can get in the way. And whether that's emotional, whether that's social, whether that's all sorts of things, the assessment of clinical competence is in a very complex environment. So frameworks are really important, but even we admit that they're only going to go so far. Next. Clearly, I don't need to emphasize this to the group. The lack of sufficient resources is going to be a barrier. Next. In a lot of places, conversation isn't valued, and asking for the time to have a conversation with someone may not necessarily be something that the culture where you work is valued. Still try to figure out what are ways that you might be able to sort of sneak that in. Next. Again, you're going to deal with faculty who are still playing from their own sheet of music, those who are quote doves or quote hawks, and how will you address that? Next. And then bias. I'm sure you're all been reading in the literature and are up to date, replete with discussions about how bias creeps into our assessment of trainees. This could be at an institutional level, which is not being written about as much, but there may be different ways that institutions view themselves, but certainly at an individual level, how that might come to play. So your responsibility is to think and plan in advance. How are you going to monitor for whether this is happening for you? Next. All right. We're just about here at the end. We're interested now. I've been doing most of the talking. So if you could go into the chat box, we're interested. Is there anything that happened because of COVID-19 that changed what you do, that changed what you did, and you think changed it for the better in trying to manage your separate sites? So you can add things in the chat that we could see, or we can also save it for sort of open-ended questions here. All right, as everyone's recovering, Mike can go to the last slide and then we'll open it up for questions. So making a quick summary, we all know geographically separate sites have benefits and challenges. We all need them in order to run our educational programs. There are accreditation standards that address key aspects and things that you'll be held to when the LCME comes and does their site visits. But it's also, these are things that you should be monitoring on your own. We believe strongly in the need for frequent conversations among program leaders, and that includes your site directors. And we'd encourage you to think sort of before, during, and after setting up a clerkship site and a training program. What are the things that need to be considered in order to be successful? And with that, that wraps our presentation. So there's a few things coming in the chat now that people can look at, and we would, Gary, if you want to open it up for conversation.
Absolutely. If anybody has questions or they want to make a comment, could you please use the reaction to raise your hand and we'll call on you to talk. Jason Rosenstock.
Thanks, Gary. That was a great presentation. I really appreciated it. I guess I was curious, you sort of talked about student feedback being part of the comparability assessment. And I'm wondering, one of the complaints that we often get from students is that, my fellow student who was at this other site got out early and I had to stay late. How much do you weigh that? Like, if all your other comparability measures are pretty much the same, how much do you weight something like that?
Thanks. Like many things, and you hate this answer, it depends. If this is a if this is sort of a one-off concern, I would probably address it with the site director. So if that got back to me from the students. So since Mike is here and since he's the site director, if a student put in their critique, like, I was here until 8 o'clock every night, but another student was leaving at 4. Or I heard my, fellow students in San Antonio. We would take it up. We would have a discussion. I would talk to Mike and we would have a discussion about what that meant. And to put it into context, if it was a recurring issue, if it was a theme that was coming up over and over again, yeah, I would say that you do have an issue that has to be addressed. There are clearly differences in expectations of the students across the sites. And as a program leader, it's up to you to try to figure out what exactly that is. So, I would see it enough as enough of a signal to do a little bit more investigation. Sometimes there's an easy explanation, or an easier explanation, I would say. I don't know if that helps, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? If not, we can bring this to a close. And I want to thank you, Mike and Paul, again for doing this great presentation. We are recording it, so it will be available on the ACE website and then probably tomorrow. And great to see everyone.
All right, great. Thank you.